His story captured headlines both here in North America and overseas in the Arab world. American Pastor Andrew Brunson was in prison for almost 2 years in Turkey, and his case became the subject of intense political maneuvering. Pastor Brunson joins me now with his wife, Norine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
We are so thrilled to see, of course, you were released after 13 days and you just about 2 years. And so good to see you released. How does it feel to be free?
It's wonderful. Everything is better than being in a Turkish prison.
I guess that's true. And Norine, what does it feel like for you to see him, to have him back for the last year?
Yeah, it's great. What we say is it's the little things that we missed. You know, when he was in prison, I said, I miss having breakfast with you, going out and having coffee with you, just the little pleasures of life that we take for granted until they're removed.
Okay, so Andrew, tell me how this all started.
Well, we were called into the police station. We thought we were going to pick up our long-term residence permits in Turkey. We'd already been there 23 years. And then they told us they were going to deport us, which shocked us. We knew we could be deported, but we thought God wanted us there to prepare for a powerful move of God. And so we were surprised when I thought, God, have you canceled our assignment? Then they took us to a deportation center. And normally within 1 or 2 days, they should deport an American. But they kept us and they kept us and kept us. And so then we knew that something was wrong and unusual in our case. There had just been a coup attempt a few months before. And Turkey was in a real turmoil. And tens of thousands of people had been arrested. And so we thought, are we just going to disappear into the system now? They did release Norine after 13 days, and then they kept me for another 2 years. And I'd say here, they kept me for 2 years, but I didn't know it would be 2 years. They wanted 3 life sentences for me, so that's the weight I was living under, is complete uncertainty, not knowing if I'd ever get out.
When we were taken to the detention center and they signed us in saying that we were a threat to national security, that's used for all deportation cases. But then the phone call came to the official right in front of us, and he checked another box for terrorism activity, and my heart just sunk because I thought something is wrong here. This is not a normal deportation. I felt that there was something bigger, worse going on.
You know, when Andrew tells the story in his book, you seem like you were feeling more strong than him in those initial days. Like he was drawing strength from you. Did you feel like the strong one?
I mean, as I said, I felt that something bigger was on, and that's kind of a sobering thing. It's like, I'm not sure we're going to get out of here so easily and so quickly. And so it sobers you up. And maybe it's kind of like, you know, just kind of holding your breath. Like, I'm not going to think about complaining about lack of this or that. Something much bigger is going on here. So I think maybe that's partly what was going on.
But I'll say that I think she was stronger at that point. And I think of the story of the tortoise and the hare. And you know, they're running a race, and the hare just runs along the rabbit. He's very fast, but he stops here and there. The tortoise just keeps going. And I was like that. Was very intense, and I'd just run after God, and then I'd slack off, and then run again. And Norine, over years, every day, setting time aside to spend in the Word and in quiet time. And I think this built a deep reservoir in her. And it wasn't that she was having all these revelations or encounters in every quiet time, but it built over time. And so when we were put in this pressure situation, you know, I've done all the theological education and was preaching and teaching, and yet I'm put in that pressured situation, and I look at Norine, and she has this deep reservoir she's drawing from, and I'm panicking. And we're just different in our emotional makeups as well. But I saw a real strength in her. And what I've said jokingly before is that they let Norine out after 13 days, and God needed another 2 years to deal with my life. But she was strong in that. And afterwards also, there was a lot of uncertainty. Would they arrest her again, or what they would do with her? And several leaders that we respect said to her, you know, you need to leave Turkey. And she refused to do that. She said, I will leave if an angel appears and tells you, it needs to be very
Needs
clear.
to be clear, yeah. Because a lot of people were feeling, okay, God is saying this, God is saying that at that time. And then it's very hard in that situation to discern, what is people's wishful thinking, what is their personal advice, and what is really the voice of God. So I said, God, I don't know, but if you want me to leave, then make it just abundantly clear.
And I think it's so good that you didn't leave. I think, Andrew,
Yeah.
that first Christmas, so you've been now in prison for a couple months, you've been in solitary confinement, Boxing Day, all the people that are with you go home get to go visit their families in the prison, visit with them. You're the only one that can't. And you're thinking about taking your own life.
I did, and there was a buildup to that. One is that I was shocked when I was moved into a prison before I'd been in detention centers. And I'd had 50 days in solitary confinement in a detention center. That was difficult. But then now I'm being accused of being a terrorist. Now it's gotten very serious. And I'm in a high security prison, and I'm surrounded by all of my cellmates are Muslims, and I'm the only Christian there, and I was completely cut off from outside contact for several weeks, and I was desperate. And
You didn't know if I was in the country at that point.
I didn't even know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Remember
And
getting a letter.
so I was very desperate, and I was very broken. And over the time, Norine was a lifeline for me. She was the only contact I had with a Christian. So she would come in during those, when we were allowed to visit, and we'd be meeting through reinforced glass on a telephone. And we had a very short time, and that prison was 35 minutes. And she'd come in and speak truth to me and try to encourage me and give me enough for me to hold on for another week. So her staying in Turkey, she stayed at personal risk. She did it because she loves me and she wanted to support me. And that was all the difference for me.
Norine, when he started wrestling with suicidal thoughts, he was thinking it would be better if he died than lose his faith because he was struggling so hard. What was that like for you, knowing you only had that 35 minutes once a week to come and try to encourage your husband?
Yeah, so I don't know if he was at that suicidal point. It wasn't always. There were periods, and there was the first time he told me about it had actually passed, so I thought, okay, we're okay. And then there was another very deep period, and there were some weeks when I really had to say, promise me that I'm going to see you next week. And he would say yes. And so I thought, okay, we're good for another week. I believed that he would keep his promise to me. But there were a few weeks that were really to that point. I don't know that it was normally at that point. That's how I felt it, at least, that there was a very deep period of about a month that it was very, very critical.
Well, Andrew, talk to me about what was happening inside of you where you were thinking, you know what, it'd be better that I just commit suicide, death by suicide, go to see God than lose my faith because of the trial you were experiencing.
So I was afraid at times that I was losing my sanity, that I would lose my mind. And I remember Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Romanian pastor who was in prison in communist Romania and tortured for 14 years. And there were people there who actually lost their minds. And we think, oh, God won't allow that, surely. He'll preserve us. Well, he didn't with those people. And Richard Wurmbrand, the way he explained it was their insanity was beautiful to God because they lost it, suffering for Jesus. And so I thought this could happen to me. There were times when I felt like I was going over the edge. I was afraid that there was no point where I wanted to walk away from my faith, even though I had doubts and questions. But I was afraid that I might slip away over time. And I was in a very intense, I had a lot of questions and doubts, and I was in a very intense environment, just surrounded by Muslims who were praying 24/7 and chanting the Quran. And I was the only Christian, and I thought, and they kept telling me, someday you will become a Muslim. And I thought, oh God, I could slip away, and I'm so afraid of that. And then I had a wrong way of thinking. I remembered that Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Better to go into heaven with one eye than into hell with both eyes. And I thought, wouldn't it be better if I just kill myself now and live, have that shame and that defeat, and yet ensure that I go to be with you? So that was a very twisted way of thinking, but I was very confused. And And I thought, would I rather be in heaven or spend the rest of my life in a Turkish prison? And heaven sounds much more attractive to me.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So Norine, you're seeing this all play out, trial, the terrorism charges, the threats of all these different sentences, and the rest of his life potentially in prison. How's your spiritual life going as you're trying to deal with this reality?
Again, I just was aware that this was so beyond anything I had expected, or I was aware of my need for God, and that I just didn't dare try to walk it on my own. I had to be pressing into Him. And so in the early days, I would just literally, and I still do it, but I would literally, before I got up in the morning, I'm just putting my hand up saying, Lord, I'm taking your hand. I have got to walk through this day with you. And it became, it changed from saying, come, walk with me through this day, to saying, God, you're leading the way, and I'm just following. So it was really an awareness of needing God. Yeah.
You know, Andrew, you were mentioning you're in a room that was made for how many people?
It was made for 8 people, but there were over 20 of us crowded in.
And they became very hostile to you over time because of your faith.
Some of them did. Some of them were friendly. There was a mixture. But they were all very strong Muslims. And so I had many doubts and questions, but they couldn't understand my struggle that was going on with God. Because my expectations were formed by, God says that He's a father, and I'm His son. And He also describes Himself as a husband, and I'm the object of His passion. I'm the bride. And I thought, wait, I'm a father, and I'm married, I have a wife, and I would never treat my children or my wife this way. Because what really surprised me was, after pursuing presence of God for so many years and focusing on that, I lost all sense of God's presence. And so I wasn't hearing His voice. I didn't sense strength or joy or His grace. I didn't sense His presence with me. And I thought, God, have you just turned me over and abandoned me in this, my most difficult time? This is when I need your presence especially. And so I was very confused. And I forgot what you asked me.
You know what, I was just thinking, over time, so that, you started in that place and you were in that place for a long time, but over time, things started shifting for you into a new place. I remember at one point you were being transferred to another prison and you started having some thoughts about what real freedom actually is. Tell me about some of the things that started shifting in your mind.
Yeah, so they were transferring me. I'm in this prison bus in a bubble inside, and I'm surrounded by people with machine guns, and they're transferring me to maximum security prison, and I was really stressed about this. I didn't know what was going to happen. And I'm seeing all of these people driving home in their cars, and I'm going through the city that I lived in for so many years, seeing all these things that are familiar to me, but are now so distant, and I'm torn away from them. And I thought, all these people are going back to their homes. I don't know if I'll ever go back to my home. But then I thought, all the people around me in these cars, probably none of them know about Jesus Christ. And I do. And so my future is secure. Whatever happens to me, whether I'm released or not, whether I die in prison or can go back to my family, my future is secure. And my life has meaning that none of these people have experienced yet. And it just gave me a different perspective. But what really changed is I went from this period of brokenness. We've talked about having suicidal thoughts and just being so in the depths of despair and having confusion. I came to a point where I began to fight for my faith. And one of the things that I had deep offense toward God. And this was because, as I mentioned, I'd always run after His presence, and here it was removed. He removed that sense of His presence.
In the hardest time.
In the hardest time. And I remember at one time saying, God, are you just a God of conferences? You show up when we're all together and happy and having a great day. Where are you in the hardest time? And so I had this offense and questions and doubts. And these were suffocating me. They were suffocating my relationship with God. So I couldn't receive when Norine would come in and speak truth to me. I'd say, yes, but. When I read the Bible, it's yes, but. Because the doubts intrude and the offense in my heart toward God, the hurt. And there was a turning point for me where I visualized a lockbox, and I put my doubts and my questions into that lockbox, and I closed it. And it's a high-tech box in my imagination, and it had a digital handprint, and I closed that thing, and I said, God, only you and I can open this. If you want to open it, you can open it any time if you want to deal with these issues. But I make the decision that I will not open this box. I will not entertain these questions or doubts. I do not need to have answers to have a relationship with you. And that was a turning point. After that, I still had those doubts and questions come back, but I didn't give them a place in my mind. I said, no, I refuse to entertain these thoughts. And that opened up so that I was able to begin to receive again from God. So did I get an answer to my questions? No. But it was a decision. It doesn't matter. Wow. It's much more important. If I may never get the answers, but I don't need them to have a relationship with you.
Norine, what was it like for you seeing this shift happen in Andrew? I'm sure that you've been praying for so much during that time.
Yeah, it was gradual. So, he says generally the first year was a year of breaking, and the second year God was rebuilding him. But the truth is, and that is a generalization, but the truth is there were points of victory in the first year too. And the second year wasn't just a straightforward victory. It was still up and down. But yeah, he talks about how difficult it was, and he's wonderfully transparent in the book. I think that's the strength, because people can really relate to that. But there were real victories. I knew how he was struggling. I knew how he was in despair and afraid, and this was just lonely. And in the midst of that, when he would write, I decided this, or I prayed that, I was like, yes. And how many times one of the first letters, he said, I'm willing to be made willing. And I thought, that's enough. I kept that letter by my bed. I kept saying, God, here it is. So I really saw many points of victory.
Can I tell you one?
Yeah.
So I'd read about how Richard Wurmbrand, he's in this Romanian prison, how at one point he remembered the words of Jesus, and when he says, when people persecute you, rejoice. And he said, I need to do this. So he started dancing in his cell. And I read this, and I came under such conviction, and I said, oh God, I haven't had any joy I'd already been in prison for a year. I said, I haven't had any joy. But here you say, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil things about you. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And I said, I'm going to do this. And I made the decision that I would dance for 5 minutes a day. And so I didn't feel like it. I wasn't happy and joyful. But I'd start out and I'd say, God, I repent. I confess that I have not had joy. And I ask you to give me that joy. But I am now going to perform an act of joy before you. And then I'd begin to sing those verses, blessed are you when people revile you. And I'd begin to leap and dance around.
Wow.
Of course, my cellmates, what is that guy doing? But I did that even on days when I was really depressed, when I was really discouraged and in despair. I'd say, this is a sacrifice to the Lord.
Wow.
It's an act of obedience, very separate from my feelings. I am rejoicing before God, even though I don't feel it. And what Norine told me, you can go ahead.
Yeah, no, I pictured really that in the little tiny courtyard where he would pace and sing a song and dance, that, there are angels that would really get up with him and dance with him. I knew God was waiting every day to hear the song that he sang.
Wow.
There were these points of incredible victory. Nobody was seeing those. And then there was the big victory in court, where he gave the gospel, where he publicly forgave. That day was such a beautiful public victory. I wish that more people had been there to witness it, but in all the spiritual world was seeing this. These are things that were spoken that were so powerful. So on one hand, I left that day driving back, we passed the convoy. He's right there, so close, but I know he's probably in despair and discouraged. So I'm feeling terrible for him. At the same time, I'm like, what a victory today. What an amazing proclamation. I was so proud of him and what he had done.
It strikes me in many ways that you were free before you were free. In a sense, like you had found a measure of freedom emotionally, spiritually, a submission to God, a willingness that you hadn't had initially in prison before you became free, but it was just over 2 years that you were actually, within 24 hours, you were going to your trial, and within 24 hours, you were in the White House. Tell me about that 24-hour period.
So I think the point I came to was of saying, I want to serve your purposes, even if it means staying in prison. I don't want to be in prison, but give me strength to persevere and endure. And that became a daily battle. So you ask about the last day. Well, we go into court and
Exhausted, not knowing how it's going to end. He had 2 bags packed, one for prison, one to go back to prison after
Because he was on house arrest at that point, yeah.
And one in case he were released. So, we're saying goodbye, not knowing what kind of a goodbye it is. Very difficult. We're tired, stressed, and go on.
And then they convict me. They convict me of terror crimes and sentence me. And at that time, I just kind of faded out, and I'm thinking, okay, God, they're sending me back to prison. They've just sentenced me to prison. Please, can you send me back to the same cell so I don't have to start over with new people and just dreading, oh no, this is back to prison and I don't know when it will end. And then my lawyer's coming over and saying, Andrew, you can go. I said, where? You mean go to prison? He says, no, you're free to go. And so they convicted me and sentenced me, and then they released me while it was appealed. And they said, you can leave the country, which means please go as soon as possible. Because there had been a lot of pressure that came on them. And just the emotions of going through that, the uncertainty, and then the conviction, and then suddenly we're going to the airport, trying to get out of there as quickly as possible before they change their minds. And then we're back in the States and in the White House within 1 day. I thought, this is such a God thing to turn it around like this.
You must have been in a complete state of shock.
It was very surreal to me. And part of the trauma, one of the results of trauma is a feeling of distance. And that's what I felt for several months after I got out. This is all happening to somebody else, a sense of detachment. Like, this isn't really me, it's happening to someone else.
I think you, more than anyone else, can speak to people who are watching this interview, who are in dark places in their own life, feel like God is far away, don't understand it, don't see a way out, don't know if or when it will ever end. Yeah. What would be your advice to someone who's feeling like you were?
Yeah. So there's a verse that I hung on to for my time in prison. It's Isaiah 50:10, and it says something like this: for the one who is walking in darkness and has no light, trust in the name of your God and lean on Him. And this is what I felt, that I was in darkness. What's interesting to me in the verse is this was said to Israel in exile, so He could have removed the darkness and given them light, but He didn't do that right away. Instead, He said, when you're in darkness and have no light, lean. Mm-hmm. And so this is what I felt that I was learning, is I'd been so focused on presence of God, and I still do. That's what I really want. And now God was saying, you need to learn to stand in the dark when you don't have light and lean into me. So I had so many questions and doubts, and I came to realize that it wasn't God's love and His faithfulness that were being tested. They never are. They're consistent. It was my love and faithfulness that was being tested. Mm. And would I love God when I didn't sense His presence? Would I be faithful when I was in the dark? And I was. But I was tested. And so every one of us goes through tests. I have people say to me, well, I'm going through this difficulty. Oh, but it's nothing like what you experienced in prison. I said, you know what? Each one of us has tests, and those tests are enough to knock us out. Your tests are enough to knock you out. Mine are enough to knock me out. And the question is, are you going to survive those tests? Is your relationship, your friendship with God going to survive them? And I say, you have to. You have to make that decision. Like putting those doubts away in that box that I described. You have to make the decision. I will not allow offense to take root in my heart. Even if I have doubts and questions, I'm going to cling to God, and I'm going to love you, and I'm going to be faithful, and I'm going to stand in the dark. And every person can do that, no matter how weak you feel. I say, I had a lot of grace, but I didn't feel it. It was unfelt grace. And most people are going to go through times like that, where they experience the silence of God and feel like they're in the dark. You're being tested. You need to make it through. And you can do that by turning your face toward God. Just make that simple decision. And God will meet you there. You may not sense it, but He will carry you through them.
And later on, you will not have any regrets. You know, nobody who chooses to keep looking to God will have regrets in the end, the very, very end, maybe.
Just waiting for the end. And as you said, you never knew you were going to be out within 2 years. Many times in trials, we don't know the end of it. But, you know, the weight of the words that you said, you lived it every day for 2 years, you wrestled it out, you struggled it through, and we're so thankful that you came through. Thank you so much for coming to share your story. There's so much more than we were able to cover here, but I just love the wisdom that you had to share, that you brought out with you.
Thank you.